As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Netanyahu says the hostage deal would only delay an attack on Rafah. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explained that if Israel agrees to a new hostage deal with Hamas, it would only delay the Israeli attack on Rafah. International aid organizations have warned that an attack on the city of 1.5 million will be devastating to the civilian population. So there was some progress when it comes to the hostage deal negotiations. The U.S., Egypt, and Qatar, they presented a new outline for a hostage deal to Israel during these talks on Friday that I think were held in Paris. And apparently the outline would be a 6-week pause in fighting in exchange for the release of 40 Israeli captives. Hamas, I think there's about a little over 100 who are still left in Gaza. So they would release 40. That would probably be, the remaining non-soldiers. And Israel would also release a few hundred Palestinians. But this deal was worked out between the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar. So again, they presented it to Israel. So it's not clear if either side is going to go for this thing. But at least that's the potential deal that is on the table. But still, you have Hamas is their top priority has been trying to end this thing permanently, permanent ceasefire. And Netanyahu, what he said in this is basically that even if we agree to this deal, once the ceasefire is over, we're going to go right back at it, and that includes the attack on Rafah. He said, quote, "Once we begin the Rafah operation, the intense phase of fighting is weeks away from completion, not months. If we don't have a deal, we'll do it anyway," end quote. So saying if there is no deal, they're going to do it. And I know Benny Gantz said that they would do it by Ramadan if there was no deal, which starts on March 10th. But also, if there is a deal, they're going to do it again anyway. Now, I think it'll be much harder for Netanyahu to restart if there's a 6-week ceasefire, if there's 6 weeks of calm in Gaza. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him not to restart it, internationally at least. I don't think the U.S. is going to put any pressure on him, unfortunately. We haven't seen any change in thinking when it comes to the unconditional military support. But this goes to show that, his plan is to keep this thing going, really no matter what, hostage deal or no hostage deal. It's from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, and it says that the planned expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank is inconsistent with international law, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, potentially signaling a policy shift for Washington. Speaking to media in Buenos Aires on Friday, the top U.S. diplomat addressed reports that Tel Aviv intends to construct thousands of new settlement units across the West Bank, saying that the White House was disappointed by the news. This was something that was announced by Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who's also a minister in the defense ministry, and in that minister position, he's basically in charge of the West Bank. And this guy is a settler himself and explicitly wants to kick all the Palestinians out of there. So Blinken said, quote, "Our administration maintains a firm opposition to settlement expansion. And in our judgment, this only weakens and does not strengthen Israel's security," end quote. And then he added that settlements were inconsistent with international law and counterproductive to reaching enduring peace. And these comments appear to mark a return to previous U.S. policy, which for decades regarded Israel's racially exclusive colonies as a clear violation of international law. Again, U.S. officials are surprised by Houthi capabilities. So this is another one from Kyle, and it says that Joe Biden administration officials admitted that 6 weeks into the undeclared war in Yemen, the U.S. and U.K. strikes have failed to erode the Houthis' military capabilities. The official said that the U.S. is surprised at the Houthis' military capabilities and that Washington has a limited understanding of how advanced their weapons systems are. So, again, since the U.S. started bombing Yemen in January, we have just seen an escalation of Houthi attacks, especially in the past week or two. And what this is based on a CNN report, U.S. officials speaking to CNN, they basically say that they have no idea how much damage they're actually doing to the Houthis, and that they're surprised that they're able to keep increasing these attacks. One senior U.S. official said, quote, "They continue to surprise us. We just don't have a good idea of what they still have," end quote. And other officials are saying that they might escalate into targeting Houthi leadership, so starting to kill higher up high-level Houthi officials. And what's interesting is that this report also says that some administration officials now believe the best way to end the conflict is by ending the war in Gaza. Who would have thought that? And those officials believe that the Houthis will be faithful to their stated policy that the strikes on shipping will end once the Israeli onslaught in Gaza concludes. So Hopefully more and more officials in the U.S. government begin to understand that, but unfortunately right now it seems like escalation is the name of the game here. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Ukraine has the right to hit Russian military targets outside of Ukraine. The remarks were made as members of the North Atlantic Alliance are preparing to send Kiev weapons with longer ranges. The Kremlin has explained that it will claim more Ukrainian territory to offset the threat presented by the long-range arms. Stoltenberg said, quote, Ukraine has the right to self-defense, and that includes also striking legitimate military targets, Russian military targets outside of Ukraine. This is international law, and of course, Ukraine has the right to do so to protect itself, end quote. So apparently this is the first time that Stoltenberg explicitly endorsed Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. So very, very provocative statement here from NATO and very concerning.
Mercy Otis Warren, and she had 18 main objections to the Constitution, but she grounded her entire case in the principles of the American Revolution in opposition to centralized, consolidated power. I'm going to highlight some of the juiciest warnings. You can, of course, read the whole thing. It's a pretty long one, especially where the one where she predicts everything would lead to an uncontrolled despotism. But let's kick it off here, right from her. Well, if I can find my notes here, right from the first sentence, she says, mankind may amuse themselves with theoretic systems of liberty and trace its social and moral effects on sciences, virtue, industry, and every improvement of which the human mind is capable. But we can only discern its true value by the practical and wretched effects of slavery. And thus dreadfully will they be realized when the inhabitants of the eastern states are dragging out a miserable existence only on the gleanings of their fields, and the southern, blessed with a softer and more fertile climate, are languishing in hopeless poverty. She's saying, okay, when this type of scenario, when we are living that, they're going to ask, when asked, what has become of the flower of their crop and the rich produce of their farms? They may answer in the hapless style of the man of La Mancha. The exigencies of government require that the collectors of the revenue should transmit it to the federal city. And I'm pretty sure this is a reference to Don Quixote, published in the early 17th century. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. In other words, don't live in some kind of crazy fantasy land. But in reality, the reality that you're going to live in is going to be all power and wealth will end in the federal city, the center. She continues. She said, animated with the firmest zeal for the interest, she was a playwright, and she wrote very poetically. So she said, animated with the firmest zeal for the interest of this country, the peace and union of the American states, and the freedom and happiness of a people who have made the most costly sacrifices in the cause of liberty. Again, pointing right to the revolution and the sacrifices that were made for liberty. She says, who have braved the power of Britain, weathered the convulsions of war, and waded through the blood of friends and foes, to establish their independence and to support the freedom of the human mind. I cannot silently witness this degradation without calling on them before they are compelled to blush at their own servitude and to turn back their languid eyes on their lost liberties, to consider that the character of nations generally changes at the moment of revolution. So she's really highlighting, she's like stirring up emotions, especially for people who lived through the revolution or their family lived through the revolution or lost people through the revolution. Hey, we went through quite a bit. We lost a lot and we sacrificed a great deal for what? And that's what we have to think about. Is liberty the primary object or is it something else? And she continues focusing on the right of self-defense, and she keeps hitting on natural rights, which I think is pretty awesome. She said, self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish. And of course, self-defense is not just individual self-defense. It's not just defending your person and your property against maybe criminals down the street. It's not only self-defense against foreign invasions, but it's also self-defense of people with power in your own governments. And you have to defend yourself against, well, their machinations. And she said, the immediate gift of the Creator, so this right of self-defense, this natural right, this is a gift, but you don't just sit there and not use it. She's saying you gotta stand up for what you believe in. She said, the immediate gift of the Creator obliges everyone to remonstrate against the strides of ambition and a wanton lust of domination, and to resist the first approaches of tyranny. Don't wait until it gets stuck in and try to fix it later on. She was, as we'll see here in this episode, she was not too happy with the Massachusetts ratification, where she was from, Massachusetts ratification of the Constitution, where instead of saying we won't ratify until we get the amendments we want in advance, we'll go ahead and do it on a gentleman's agreement, and you will promise to do the right thing later on. She didn't trust that. So she said, you have to resist the first approaches of tyranny. Don't let it gain hold. Take a stand against it now. She said, which at this day threaten to sweep away the rights for which the brave sons of America have fought with a heroism scarcely paralleled even in ancient republic. If you're going to form a system of government, which of course was part of the Lee Resolution in July of 1776, was it June of, well, whenever it passed, it called to create a system of government. It called to create the Declaration of Independence. If you're going to create that based out of, well, we got away from this certain government, you really want to focus on those first principles. And here from Constitution Center, they describe it like this. Warren viewed the Constitution from the perspective of the spirit of 76, the original animating principles of the Revolution, and explained in vivid poetic prose, which you just got a little taste of, hopefully I did it justice, why the proposed system of government posed much the same threat to American liberty as the British government once had. So she would say, like, look, why are we replicating the same thing here? She saw it that way. She said, they write, there was a tragic irony here. As Warren saw it, the same population that had risked their lives to escape distant, centralized tyranny now appeared willing, a mere decade later, to settle for much the same at home.
Professor Ivanovsky, he says the CIA's partnership with Ukraine can be traced back to 2 phone calls. Now, this actually is from the article. 2 phone calls on the night of February 24th, 8 years ago to the day before Russia's full-scale invasion, and it would be literally as the Maidan coup was taking place, as the consolidation of the coup was taking place, the U.S.-backed coup. And the scene setter is millions of Ukrainians had just overrun the country's pro-Kremlin government, and the president, Viktor Yanukovych, and his spy chiefs had fled to Russia. In the tumult, a fragile pro-Western government quickly took power. That's the New York Times wording, fragile, backed by the U.S. So here's the point that the New York Times article is making. The government's new spy chief, Valentin Navalchenko, arrived at the headquarters of the domestic spy agency and found a pile of smoldering documents in the courtyard. Inside, many of the computers had been wiped or were infected with Russian malware. He went to an office and called the CIA station chief and the local head of MI6. It was near midnight, but he summoned them to the building and asked for help to rebuild the agency from the ground up and proposed a 3-way partnership. That's how it started, Mr. Navalchenko said. So this brings us back to literally the end of the coup. The coup government sent in someone to run their intel services. His first 2 phone calls were to CIA and MI6 back in 2014 and said, hey, can you come over here? Can you come help us rebuild the intelligence service? Now, anyone that understands even a little bit about how this works, this means that it brought the entirety of the Ukrainian intelligence services within the fold of the CIA. Essentially, the entirety, the SBU and the rest of the secret services of Ukraine became subcontractors for the CIA. They essentially took over the entire operation. Now, here's something that's even more interesting. If you put this next one on, this is back to a professor from Ottawa. This is a quote from an article. During a previous stint as a spy chief, Mr. Navalchenko started a similar partnership with the CIA, which was dissolved when the country swung back toward Russia. Now, this is an important point that may be lost on some people because this takes us back even further than 2014, because that previous stint at spy chief would have been under Yushchenko, who, as you may remember, was put into power after the Orange Revolution in 2004, replacing Yanukovych, who had been elected. So I know it's getting confusing, but Yanukovych was elected president in the early 2000s Ukraine. He was reelected in 2004. The U.S. said this was a fake election. They helped a previous color revolution, the Orange Revolution, take over. They installed Yushchenko in power, and the spy chief under Yushchenko, he immediately started a partnership with the CIA. So this has been a CIA operation well before the 10 years ago after the Maidan. It had happened a lot further than that. So some of the other things, let's go to the next one, because the New York Times article also talks about a network of 12 secret bases that had been built along the Russian border. The CIA built 12 secret bases along the Russian border. The work began 8 years ago. These intelligence bases, from which Russian commanders' communications can be swept up and Russian spy satellites monitored, are being used to launch and track cross-border drone and missile attacks on Russian territory. So the CIA has bases on the border of Russia from which it is coordinating the launch of drone and missile attacks inside of Russia. So go to the next one now, because this is important, I think. This is from the Zero Hedge article. This means that with the disclosure of the long-time closely guarded secret, the world just got a big step closer to World War III. Given it means the CIA is largely responsible for the effectiveness of the recent spate of attacks, which have included direct drone hits on key oil refineries and key infrastructure. So that tells you, can you imagine if the Chinese were operating on our border with Mexico, destroying our petrochemical industry here in the United States, what would be the reaction? Again, referring back to the Chinese balloon we were ready to go to war over. The report emphasizes, but whatever Trump said and did, his administration often went in the other direction. And we talked about this on the Liberty Report over and over. It didn't seem to matter what Trump said. His administration did something different. They did what they wanted to do. Now going back to the quote, this is because Trump had put Russia hawks in key positions, including Pompeo as CIA director and Bolton as national security advisor. Well, that was a boneheaded thing to do when we talked about it at the time. But this is what they did. They simply ignored their boss. And so here's a further quote. They visited Kiev to underline their full support for this secret partnership, which expanded to include more specialized training programs and the building of additional secret bases. So Trump is getting elected saying, what's wrong with getting along with Russia? Why do we need to provoke Russia? Why do we need a war with Russia? The entire time he's president, his own intelligence community is continuing in expanding a secret war with Russia. Now you could say it's Trump's fault because he should have got a handle on these people, and that's true. But remember what Schumer said, they have 7 ways from Sunday to get back at you if you tangle with the intelligence community, and that may be part of what's happening. But the other thing that's interesting, though, if you think about that first impeachment, what was Trump impeached for? He was impeached for literally going against the recommendations of the experts in the intelligence community. I think, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, I think Trump knew the gig was up. He knew what was happening, and it was a last-ditch effort to prevent them from doing what they were doing by trying to cancel the assistance to Ukraine, that final assistance, which people like Vindman, a Ukrainian, someone who hates Trump, who was working inside the White House and spilled the beans, blew the whistle, basically made up a bunch of lies about Trump to get him impeached. Trump was trying to go against what the intelligence community was doing in Ukraine, i.e. provoking war with Russia. And for that, he ran up against the third rail. And the third rail is the deep state. And the deep state did his best to take him down. Now, this isn't praise for Trump because he did a lot of terrible and dumb things. However, it just goes to show the extent to which they will go to make sure that U.S. foreign policy is completely aligned with what the deep state wants. And what the deep state wants is war, war, and more war.